Out of the softening sunset came the airship, and the manner of its moving was beautiful. Few inanimate objects attain beauty in the pursuance of their courses, and yet, to me, at least, the flight of this ship was far lovelier than the swooping of a bird or the jumping of a horse. For it seemed to carry with it a calm dignity and consciousness of destiny, which ranked it among the wonders of time itself. That night, at my first sight of her, she overawed me as nothing else has ever done. She was so huge and strong, so inspiring of emotion, and yet at the same time so remote of it herself. But perhaps the strongest magic which she exerted came from the fact that her hues, and hence her moods, were ever changing. She never looked the same, for no 2 days are even quite alike, and her silvery hull took to itself the colour and feeling of every time of day or night in which she flew. On she came towards us, with a motion as smooth as a glide, though by the steady droning music of her engines I knew her to be a powerful creature going calmly about her business. Lower and lower she slid as she circled wide above the lake, and so still was the water that the ship's reflection seemed more clearly formed than was she herself. The whole life of the evening was attuned to her rhythm. It is 7:25 p.m. on the 6th of May, 1937. Lakehurst Naval Air Station, New Jersey. The German airship LZ-129 Hindenburg, the largest flying object yet seen, hovers around 800 feet from the mooring mast. Late arriving into Lakehurst because of earlier thunderstorms, the Hindenburg is moments away from successfully completing her first transatlantic crossing of the 1937 season. On board, the 36 passengers, just over half her capacity of 70, scan the crowd for glimpses of waiting friends and family. Forward, in the control car, Zeppelin Captain Max Pruss calls down a cheery hello to Commander Charles Rosendahl of the US Navy, the station commander, and himself a brave and experienced airshipman. Rosendahl waves back. There, he later wrote, in an imposing, majestic silence, the vast, silvery hulk of the Hindenburg hung motionless like a framed, populated cloud. Many seem to have experienced that same motionless moment, that same sudden silent pause that Rosendahl described. Passenger Gertrude Adelt, watching from the airship's lounge, noticed that suddenly everything had grown strangely silent. Her husband, Leonard, said that suddenly there occurred a remarkable stillness. The motors were silent, and it seemed as if the whole world was holding its breath. One heard no call, no command, no cry. Then, from the rear of the ship on the port side, observers on the ground saw a small flame and a fluttering of the ship's hull. In the comfortable passenger quarters, people reported feeling a shudder or a jolt. And in the control car, the officers initially thought that one of the lengthy mooring lines had broken. Captain Albert Samt looked down and noted that both lines were intact, but then in horror saw the huge airship hangar off their port side lit up in a fiery reflection. And at the same time, someone in the control car called out the sickening news that the Hindenburg was on fire.
The back motors of the ship are just holding it just enough to keep it from... It bursts into flames. Get it started. It's fighting and it's crashing. It's crashing terrible. Oh, my, get out of the way, please. It's bursting into flames and it's falling on the mooring mast, and all the folks agree that this is terrible. This is one of the worst catastrophes in the world. Oh, it's like 400 or 500 feet into the sky. It's a terrific crash, ladies and gentlemen. The smoke and the flames now, and the frame is crashing to the ground, not quite to the mooring mast. All the humanity and all the passengers feeding around it. I told you, I can't talk to people. His friends are on there. I can't talk, ladies and gentlemen. Honest, it's just like that massive smoking wreckage. And everybody can't hardly breathe and talk and screaming. Lady, I'm sorry. honestly, I can hardly breathe. I'm going to step inside where I cannot see it.
Over 4,000 miles away, in a hotel room in Graz, Austria, Hugo Eckener, chairman of the German Zeppelin Transport Company, the firm which operated the Hindenburg, and a character who will undoubtedly become a hero of this podcast, was awoken painfully by the sound of a telephone ringing in the early hours of Friday morning. Eckener, a vocal anti-Nazi sidelined by Hitler's government and only just recently kicked upstairs into his rather meaningless chairman role, was in Austria on a lecture tour. But that day, he had answered an invitation to visit the studio of sculptor Gustinus Ambrosi, an intense man with brightly burning eyes who had wanted to show Eckener his sculpture of Icarus plunging into the sea after flying too close to the sun. Eckener, somewhat shaken by this, had wondered at the time if it was meant as some sort of warning or indeed a premonition. Eckener had spent the evening in the company of engineering students and, according to his excellent autobiography, My Zeppelins, had overdone the wine a little, making it that much harder to rouse himself to the sound of the ringing phone. But, as he says, I seized the receiver and was shocked wide awake by what I heard. It was a call from Berlin, from the representative of the New York Times, whom I knew. He explained, Herr Eckener, I felt it was necessary to inform you at once that I have just received a message from my office in New York, according to which the airship Hindenburg exploded yesterday evening at 7 p.m. above the airfield at Lakehurst. You will hardly be able to comment on this, for I still know nothing more about it. Eckener recalls his shocked reaction. Naturally, I couldn't say anything. I was thunderstruck. The Icarus of Ambrosi. I had plenty of time to consider the matter during the stillness of the night. We can only imagine the torture of those long night hours for Hugo Eckener, who had been with the Zeppelin Company almost since the very beginning. Of course, he speculated on what might have caused the explosion. The situation was so unthinkable, his mind immediately went to sabotage. But he must also have experienced the dreadful, creeping thought that whatever had happened, it represented the end of the airship dream. That all the work, the struggle, the negotiating and persuading and strong-arming he had done over the years to keep the dream alive had been snuffed out in a split second. And although he would not yet have known about it, it's easy to believe that Hugo Eckener even then somehow sensed the significance of that curious calm moment at 7:25 p.m. on the 6th of May 1937 in the skies above Lakehurst, where time seemed to stand still and where the future of aviation hung in the balance. Welcome to episode 1 of Upship, the Airship History podcast. I'm Nick Rogers, and I will be your captain on this long-haul flight through the history of that most beautiful, mysterious, and otherworldly of aircraft, the Airship. Think of this episode as sort of like your pre-flight briefing. Before we dive into the endlessly fascinating world of airship history, I thought it was worth spending some time discussing why I even wanted to do this podcast and why I think people will be interested in the subject. Many old airship hands will roll their eyes at the cliché of beginning a history of airships with the Hindenburg disaster. They would have a point. It is a bit of a cliché and has become more so as the years go on. Even now, it's hard to find an article or news report about airships that doesn't feature those grimly iconic photographs or the raw emotion of Herb Morrison's commentary that you heard earlier in the episode. Almost 90 years on, the tragedy endures, although the last survivor passed away in 2019. There are, however, good reasons why it endures. Quite obviously, the photographs and films of the disaster are among the most striking of the 20th century. The tragedy was not just an aviation moment, but a massive global media moment, the first time such a huge disaster had been captured on film. And I know that even now, listeners new to the world of airships will be able to see those horrific pictures in their mind's eye. But more than that, what those images captured is rare, a true watershed moment where the relentless train of history switches from one track to another before our very eyes. For there were two tragedies on the 6th of May 1937. One was the immediate personal human tragedy of the wreck of the Hindenburg and the loss of those lives and all the pain and suffering that ripples out from such awful bereavement. The other tragedy was, as we left Hugo Eckener pondering in the lonely darkness of his hotel room, the death of a beautiful dream. Because it really did seem, at 7:25 p.m. on the 6th of May 1937, that finally airships had established themselves as the future of long-distance travel. As the Hindenburg was completing her flight across the North Atlantic, the LZ-127 Graf Zeppelin was on her 64th round trip across the South Atlantic to Brazil, under the command of Captain Hans von Schiller, who sensibly kept the news of the Hindenburg disaster quiet from the crew and passengers until just before they landed back in Germany. The Graf Zeppelin, that most fated and beloved of airships, had a glittering and adventurous career that took in the deserts of Egypt, the ice of the Arctic Circle, and the rainforests of Brazil. She had flown around the world, carried over 13,000 passengers, more than 1 million miles, breaking endurance records, and by the end of her commercial career, cutting the journey time from Rio de Janeiro to Friedrichshafen in southern Germany down to 61 hours. The only other option was a long, uncomfortable, often unbearably hot voyage by steamer. The airship made enough money to pay for herself and to help finance the construction of her successors. The Graf Zeppelin was the proof of concept for transcontinental airship flight. The Hindenburg, however, was the apogee, the summit of everything that had been learned so far about airship design through trial and error, blood, sweat and tears, and hard-won empirical knowledge. She was supposed to make airship flight not a grand adventure, as on the early days of the Graf Zeppelin, but routine and dependable, attractive to celebrities, captains of industry, and other such affluent people. The Hindenburg could fly from Frankfurt to Lakehurst in a little over 2 days, making a little under 2 days on the return trip. The alternatives were either a pleasant but slow voyage on an ocean liner or a cramped, noisy, uncomfortable and dangerous series of hops via flying boat. The first non-stop transatlantic flight, for example, was an epic of survival by the British aviators Alcock and Brown in a freezing open cockpit biplane, and ended with a bumpy landing in an Irish bog. The second non-stop transatlantic flight was a far more comfortable, if somewhat Spartan, journey just a couple of weeks later by the British airship R-34, which also made the return trip and thus completed the first round-trip transatlantic flight. The contrast between the range and endurance of airships versus aeroplanes set a precedent for the early years of commercial aviation. So although we look back now and see the triumph of the aeroplane as inevitable, at 7:25 p.m. on the 6th of May 1937, that was not at all apparent, but all that changed in the fraction of a second. We will of course return to cover the Hindenburg disaster in far more detail on the podcast, and we'll look at the Graf Zeppelin, Hugo Eckener, the R-34 and the whole fascinating story of the airship, from the very early days of flight right up to the developments of the present day. But an important question is why? Why should we care about the history of airships, and why is it worth creating and listening to a podcast about them? And I'll tackle that after the break. I've always felt that such effects as were produced by the Zeppelin airship were traceable in a large degree to aesthetic feelings. The mass of the mighty airship hull, which seemed matched by its lightness and grace, and whose beauty of form was modulated in delicate shades of colour, never failed to make a strong impression on people's minds. It was not, as generally described, a silver bird soaring in majestic flight, but rather a fabulous silvery fish floating quietly in the ocean of air and captivating the eye just like a fantastic exotic fish seen in an aquarium. And this fairy-like apparition, which seemed to melt into the silvery blue background of sky when it appeared far away, lighted by the sun, seemed to be coming from another world and to be returned there like a dream. Hugo Eckener there, talking about the Graf Zeppelin and showing the flair for language and communication that would help him first get hired by Count von Zeppelin and then to prove so helpful in his role as the greatest airship impresario of them all. And Eckener's point is well made. The very sight of a large rigid airship must have been awe-inspiring. Those lucky enough to witness an airship such as the Graf Zeppelin or the Hindenburg never forgot the experience. There's a photo I love of the British airship R101 riding her mooring mast in Cardington, looking massive, imposing, and otherworldly. In the foreground, a young farmer tends to his field with a horse-drawn plough. To us, looking at that picture now, it seems to show two relics of the past. But back then, in 1930, that photo actually showed a meeting of the old and the new, of tradition and modernity. The R101 looks like it has materialized, in Eckenen's words, from another world. That is clearly one of the reasons why fascination with airships endures to this day. The sheer psychological impact of their size and form, the low, sedate style of their flight. Airships are just so different from the types of aircraft we're used to nowadays. Even the small blimps that you might find advertising Subway sandwiches, or the Discovery Channel's Shark Week over American cities, and more on those another day. But how can we possibly compute an airship like the Hindenburg, a flying object almost the size of the Titanic? Today, people look back and wonder what it must have been like to fly down to Rio on the Graf Zeppelin, sipping a cocktail while the rolling hills of Germany and France gave way to the white-tipped breakers of the South Atlantic and eventually to the lush green vegetation of Brazil. There is an inherent fascination with the idea of Zeppelin flight. In an age of budget airlines and uncomfortable, transactional A to B flying, people look back on the Zeppelin age as one in which flying really was romantic, glamorous, and exotic. I hope this podcast scratches that itch and will give people a glimpse into that vanished world. Vanished for now, at least. Because another reason for this podcast is the very real revival in interest in airships, not as historical objects, but as modern aircraft with useful roles to play in the 21st century economy. I write this a little after Pathfinder 1 emerged from its hangar at Moffett Field in California, named for Rear Admiral William Moffett, a fearsome airship champion who died in the crash of the USS Akron. Pathfinder 1, developed by LTA Research, is the largest aircraft built in decades and the first proper rigid airship since the Hindenburg. And in what has long been a dream of would-be airship producers, this is the brainchild of a billionaire enthusiast, Google's Sergey Brin, and is only the first in a line of planned larger airships. On my side of the pond, Hybrid Air Vehicles continues to work on its Airlander aircraft, and I remember the excitement back in 2016 when the Airlander 10 prototype, you may remember her as the Flying Bum, took to the skies over Bedfordshire. Despite a serious incident the following year when it broke free of its moorings and fell to the ground, the company is making progress and recently released a study showing the significant, genuine role their aircraft could play in linking far-flung Scottish islands to the mainland. And in their work, they are drawing on the genius and legacy of their much-missed founder, Roger Monk, a huge figure in the airship world and someone I had the privilege to meet. But it does feel like the much-anticipated airship renaissance really is, finally, hoving into view. Now, we've been here before. I remember as a kid in the late 90s reading about a whole load of exciting-sounding airship projects. Most famously, there was Cargo Lifter in Germany developing a concept for large, heavy-lifting airships. Before they went bankrupt, they built an absolutely gigantic hangar, which is now, of all things, a tropical-themed water park. But there was also rigid airship design in the Netherlands, whose founder Ian Alexander I was fortunate enough to meet a number of times, the Hamilton Airship Company in South Africa, and others. But they all sadly came to nothing. I also have in my collection an article from the January 1975 edition of Kiwani's magazine, entitled New Hope for the Airship. Illustrated with several outlandish-looking airship concepts, including one entertainingly called Megalifter, the prospects seem bright for the imminent construction of many nuclear-powered airborne behemoths. The article ends with the words, "But one thing seems certain. Chances are better today for a lighter-than-air comeback than at any time in the past 40 years. Suffice to say, that is not what transpired, and that prediction has been made many times since then. But today feels different. We don't just have nice illustrations of futuristic, never-gonna-happen airships. We have actual real-life aircraft being built and flown. And did I mention that we have a billionaire fighting our corner? So this is another reason for this podcast. I'm convinced that we will see large airships return to the skies, and soon. And I hope that they will become a more commonplace sight for more people around the world. When that happens, when, not if, it's important that people know where airships came from, and that the names and stories of those pioneers who dedicated and sometimes sacrificed their lives to the airship dream are not forgotten. Hugo Eckener reportedly said, "If we do not keep this technology, our grandchildren will have to reinvent it." And it's the same with the history. We must remember the history of these great aircraft, if for no other reason than because it is one of the only times in human history that a technology has disappeared with nothing else to take its place. And the retirement of Concorde is one of the few other examples that I can think of. And the history of airships is absolutely chock full of achievements. The first powered flight was undertaken not by the Wright brothers in 1903, but by French engineer Henri Giffard, a name cruelly lost to all but the most dedicated aviation historians more than 50 years earlier, when he flew his steam-powered airships 27 kilometers from Paris to Elancourt on the 27th of September, 1852. The Wright brothers managed 260 meters. The world's first airline was Delargue, established by the Zeppelin Company in 1909, and in less than 5 years, their fleet of airships had carried over 34,000 passengers, more than 1,500 scheduled commercial flights. The Graf Zeppelin itself notched up a host of achievements, including the first non-stop commercial transatlantic flights, the second aerial circumnavigation of the globe, completed in 21 days as opposed to the first, which took 175 days, the first non-stop crossing of the Pacific Ocean by air, and being the first aircraft to fly over 1 million miles. The first verified flight over the North Pole was by Airship, the Italian-built Norgay. Somewhat less happily, the first strategic bombing campaign was undertaken by Zeppelins against the United Kingdom in World War I. In America, the USS Akron and the USS Macon functioned as flying aircraft carriers. During World War II, the US Navy utilized a fleet of non-rigid airships for, among other tasks, convoy escort. And of the 89,000 surface ships escorted by airships in that conflict, only one was lost to enemy action. We will explore all these stories and many, many more over the course of this podcast. I'm going to take a detailed chronological look at the complete history of airships and will attempt to leave no stone unturned. We will start, as I said, from the very early days of lighter-than-air flight, progressing right up to the developments of today. Alongside the main episode, I will also be running a Patreon account with bonus episodes looking at some other aspects of airships. Here you can expect interviews, film recaps, book reviews, and more. You can sign up at patreon.com/upshippod. You can hear a clip of the first Patreon episode in which I discuss the film The Hindenburg with my film nerd husband after this episode. Now, I'm sure some of you are wondering who I am and why I am hosting this podcast. Well, although I work in the UK railway industry, when I was 9 years old, an airship flew over my school in Kent in southern England during my lunch break. It was a lightship A60 Plus advertising Mazda cars, and I'd never seen anything like it. I stood there for as long as I could, watching it bump around in the cloudy sky above my school. Little did I know that that moment, that lunch break, was probably one of the most significant moments of my life because it sparked a lifelong passion for airships that I've never shaken, nor have I wanted to. The weekend after that, I was out shopping with my mum and saw a PC game for sale called Zeppelin Giants of the Sky, more on that in a future Patreon episode. This was the 90s, so PC games always came with a nice chunky manual, and in this case, the manual included a large section dedicated to the history of airships, which I absolutely devoured. From that moment on, whenever anyone asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, I'd answer, an airship pilot, of course. Who is this strange child, people must have thought. Spoiler alert, I did not actually succeed in that ambition, although I did get to fly the Goodyear blimp when I was 15, which remains a standout memory. All my life, I've been desperate to do something with this passion. I'm not an engineer or a technician, so I've never been able to find a job at one of the small number of modern airship producers. My hope, therefore, is that this podcast will give me a way to help inspire a new generation of helium heads, and also give me a platform to advocate more broadly for a return of airships to our skies. I gave a TEDx talk on the 14th of January to more than 650 guests at TEDx Kingston upon Thames in southwest London. My talk was about airships and the roles they could play in the modern economy. The talk went down well. It seemed to spark an interest in airships among many people who have never thought about them before. And I hope that this is the first of many such opportunities to bang the drum in public for these fabulous aircraft. And when the video of the talk is edited, I will link to it. Throughout this series, I'd love to hear from listeners and to get your thoughts on the history, the airships, and the characters that will feature. Let me know if you disagree with my take on something, or heaven forbid if I make a mistake. Send me some airmail. Email the podcast at upshippodcast@gmail.com. But just a note, I'm recording the first 3 episodes back to back, so I won't be reading out listener emails until the 4th episode. You can also find the podcast on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at @upshippod, and online at www.upshippod.com. And remember again to sign up to the Patreon at patreon.com/upshippod. Incidentally, some of you may be wondering why the podcast is called Upship. Well, when the great Zeppelins of old were ready for takeoff, the captain would call out Schiff hoch, meaning upship, to the ground crew, who would give the airship a healthy push to get it airborne. I like the directness of this little phrase, and I also like that it signifies the start of a journey. And I hope this particular journey we are about to take together is as exciting and as uplifting as one of those takeoffs. Before I go, a note on my sources for today's episode. Normally I do this at the beginning so people know where I'm going for my information before they listen. The reading you heard at the beginning is from Even the Birds by an anonymous author and actually describes not the Hindenburg, but the American airship USS Akron. Other sources I drew on were The Zeppelin Reader, edited by Robert Hedin, My Zeppelins by Hugo Eckener, The Achievement of the Airship by Guy Hartcup, Hindenburg, An Illustrated History by Rick Archbold, Graf Zeppelin, Adventures of an Aerial Globetrotter by J. Gordon Veith, and the excellent Faces of the Hindenburg website, edited by Patrick Russell. That's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed your flight with us today. Please remember to like, subscribe, and review, and join me next time for more aerial adventures on Upship, the Airship History Podcast. On our next episode, we will really begin to delve into the fascinating story of airships, starting in the very early days of flight. And stay tuned for a sneak peek of our first Patreon episode. So the film starts with a newsreel about the history of airships. There's quite a sort of bombastic American announcer. I quite like that he talks about the early airships having more varieties than Heinz. I thought that's quite a good little joke.
I liked the opening, and it made me think, oh, you don't need to do this podcast about the history of airships. People could just watch the opening of this film.
Watch the opening to the Hindenburg.
Actually, I thought that was interesting. Actually, again, sort of spoiler, I do think the beginning of this film and the end of this film are very different to everything that's in the middle of the film.
Well, but the thing is, that opener is newsreel of airships, and airships are visually interesting. So it is going to be an interesting thing anyway. And the history of airships is interesting, and people listening to this must agree. Otherwise, they wouldn't be listening to this podcast. But that newsreel then leads into the opening credits, and for the first time, we see the absolutely stunning model of the Hindenburg that Robert Wise had constructed for the film. And stay to the end, and I'll tell you where that model is, where you can see it. And we have the music by David Shire, which is, again, I think the score to the film is actually very good. I think Shire's theme is excellent, and he uses music throughout the film in a good way.
It does look really cool. It opens with this strongest thing, is that it always looks really cool.
That's the thing about airships.
The special effects are really, really good.
Yeah, absolutely. Other aspects of the film maybe not so. But then the film starts. We go to Milwaukee, which I think is in Wisconsin, and a lady called Mrs. Rausch is writing. She's quite a sweaty lady. She's writing a letter and to the German embassy saying that the Hindenburg will be destroyed over American territory. We don't know why or how, but this is what she's saying.
But she's painted as a bit of a crackpot, though, isn't she?
Well, we don't know that at the beginning.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Again, that's an early spoiler. But then we cut to an airfield outside Berlin. There's a German aeroplane that's landing, and we meet the protagonist of the film, which is Franz Ritter. He's a Luftwaffe colonel, played by George C. Scott, fine actor. Probably best known for Patton, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, Patton is probably his most famous film. And in this film, again, sounds like I'm just criticizing it straight off the bat and constantly. He plays it very low key,
which isn't really George C. Scott's
No, that's
style.
actually
He's
what I was.
Quite a bombastic actor, isn't
That's what I was kind of surprised at. Why is he so low key? And he doesn't really give it any characterization. That's what I noticed.
No,
Against Anne Bancroft, who is definitely the best person in this film, who really kind of hams it up. She's in a different film. They're in different films.
To be fair, well, as we'll see, Anne Bancroft, I think, is given perhaps a bit more to work with her character.
Yeah, true.
But so Franz Ritter, Colonel Franz Ritter, Luftwaffe colonel, he lands his plane. He just got back from German involvement in the Spanish Civil War. The Germans had a unit called the Condor Legion, which was a detachment of Army and Air Force personnel who were fighting for General Franco. And he speaks to another Luftwaffe officer called Hermann. And I don't know whether it's supposed to be Hermann Goering. It doesn't seem fat enough to me. But Hermann mentions Franz Ritter's service in Spain. He mentions that Ritter's been awarded the Knight's Cross, which is actually not possible because the Knight's Cross wasn't awarded until 1939, and this takes place in 1937.
I spotted that too.
No, I'm sure you're all over that one. And that's one of a number of anachronisms and inaccuracies that this film has, and I'll point them out where I've noticed them.
It is Hollywood. I mean, come on.
Well, it's not going to be 100%
It's
accurate.
not gonna-
It can't be. So Ritter's then sent to see Joseph Goebbels, who is the Nazi propaganda minister.
I do know him.
Well, I think this must be one of the only times that Goebbels appears on film. Famously, he's in Downfall. He's a character in Downfall.
Really good film.
Absolutely cracking film. But he's not... I don't think he's in many or any other films. So that's maybe a strange feature of the Hindenburg. They're talking about the threat to the Hindenburg. Rausch, that letter of Mrs. Rausch saying that the Hindenburg's going to be destroyed, they're clearly worried that there is some kind of a plot to destroy the Hindenburg.
Why do they care what this lady has to say?
They go back to when it's at the German embassy and you have the ambassador and they have exactly that conversation with some American guy, and he's like, this threat is very specific. It says that the Hindenburg will be blown up over American territory. I mean, it doesn't sound that specific.
Yeah, but
to me,
why
anyway.
from this lady? Why specifically this lady do they care?
I'm not Robert Wise.
No, I
can't
know.
tell
I'm just
you.
saying.
And in any
now
case,
I'm thinking about it. I'm like, why do they care what she has to say? She's no one special.
but
They don't paint her as anyone special.
all the context they
No.
give is that it's very
There is
specific
that moment where
threat.
he's like, we should take this seriously. And the audience is obviously supposed to just go, yes, we agree.
We must take it seriously.